Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Elias with Minnesota Housing. Welcome to the webinar for the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program Request for Proposal process. So Nancy and I are going to split up the presentation today, and so I'll start out and then Nancy will take over. We'll kind of switch back and forth between the different sections. So our mission at Minnesota Housing is to provide access to safe, decent, and affordable housing and build stronger communities across the state by offering products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. Minnesota Housing also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing, both through the financing and long-term asset management of projects and developments. The agency has also pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. So our tutorial today is going to cover the following topics. We'll provide a brief overview of the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, also known as FHPAP. We'll talk about the program interventions and activities. We will go through the sections of the application, and then we'll give you some submission tips, as well as the question and answer session that I mentioned before. So FHPAP celebrated its 25th birthday last year. It was established in 1993 with bipartisan support from the legislature. The program only started with a few $1 million and only a couple of grantees, but it has now expanded to a base of $17,038,000 for each biennium. It covers the state, and it also includes tribal nations. Traditionally, FHPAP has been provided as a 2-year grant cycle beginning July 1st and ending June 30th. However, we are trying to improve the use of our resources at Minnesota Housing, so we've decided to align our timeline with other grant programs in the agency. One of those is the Housing Trust Fund, a rental assistance program for homeless households. As a result of this change, this biennium will be 27 months instead of the usual 24, and in the future, the grant period will start on October 1st. So because of the 27-month time frame, we increased the amount of funds available simply by adding 1 quarter's worth of funds to the existing $17,038,000. I know a number of you are aware of advocacy groups such as for all that are supporting an increase to the FHPAP base funding, but I wanted to make sure that everyone understood that the $19 million that you see listed here is really reflective only of the current base amount plus that additional quarter. The RFP instructions state that the available funding amount may change based on the legislature, and I can't predict what the legislature will do, but I just wanted you to be mindful of the amount because it is possible that there could be a change in overall funding. It's important to note, and this is very important, so I'm stressing this, if an applicant receives a high score and is recommended for funding, Minnesota Housing cannot award more than the amount requested by the applicant. Thus, you have to think really carefully about the amount you'll be requesting and consider your agency's capacity to deliver services if requesting a substantial increase. I also want to say that we do not know if there were to be a legislative increase, how we would handle that. It could be through the existing RFP. We could make another decision, but I'm just letting you know about the possibilities so that you can plan for that in your application process. Funding is divided between the metro area and greater Minnesota. The applicants from greater Minnesota compete against each other for resources, while the metro area applicants compete against those folks for resources. The program serves all populations, including families, singles, and youth. Together with many other state and federal funding streams, we consider the definition of youth age 24 and below or under age 25. Funds are flexible and can be used for a variety of activities, but the typical activities are support services, direct financial assistance, and then, of course, administration. Per the current statute, funds cannot be used for more than 24 months of assistance. So historically, the goals of FHPAP have been to prevent homelessness, eliminate homelessness, homelessness and minimize the number of days homeless. This biennium, we are further aligning our program to the Plan to Prevent and End Homelessness, also known as the Heading Home Plan. And its motto is that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. So the outcomes that you see here on the screen reflect some of the goals that we see in that plan. We are also striving to ensure that our programs have equitable outcomes for populations who are disparately impacted by homelessness. You will see this theme reflected throughout the application. The program collects data using the Homeless Management Information System, also known as HMIS. It is our hope that this system will be able to provide the reports for the outcomes that we have in this biennium. So in the past, some of you who have been grantees for a while, you know that we've had you go out and look for data and information such as emergency shelter stays, the length of how long people have been in emergency shelters, and folks have had to call around and figure out that information and data. This time around, we're really hopeful that what we have as outcomes will be something that you can pull out of an HMIS report. The eligible applicants who are allowed to apply for FHPAP funds include tribal nations, metro area counties, and in greater Minnesota, it can be a county, a group of counties, or a community-based nonprofit, provided that there's a county board resolution for each county in their service area. The eligible recipients are those whose income is below 200%, at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, a Minnesota resident or otherwise approved by our staff, and a household who is homeless or at imminent risk of homelessness, but also who is in need of services. So if they're experiencing a housing crisis, that's one thing, but you also need to demonstrate the need for that assistance. You may notice that the definition regarding being a Minnesota resident has changed slightly. Our working definition in the past was living or working in Minnesota. However, for this biennium, we will need to approve any household who's not a Minnesota housing resident prior to being allowed to receive assistance. And I'll explain this a little bit more just by telling you that over this past biennium, as part of our role in government, we've been striving to be compliant with the Office of Grants Management at the state level. And what that has meant for our staff internally is that we've really been scrutinizing our procedures and policies to ensure that we're compliant with what the Office of Grants Management wants us to be in compliance with. This has resulted in some new requirements for our grant-making process. And so as we outline the grant requirements, you may see some things that you haven't seen before. And throughout the presentation, we'll definitely highlight these changes or let you know if there are areas that you should be paying close attention to. So now I'm going to turn it over to my coworker, Nancy Urbanski, who will tell you a little bit more about the interventions and activities that can be paid for through FHPAP funding.
Applicants are eligible to apply for up to 4 intervention categories. In this section, we'll review those categories as well as services and assistance that aligns with each. The 4 interventions that are eligible under FHPAP include prevention, coordinated entry, street outreach, and rapid rehousing. Households that may be eligible for prevention include those that are at imminent risk of homelessness or those that are homeless and not able to access coordinated entry. For example, doubled-up households not assessed through coordinated entry may be eligible for prevention. Individuals and families must be homeless to be eligible for coordinated entry, street outreach, or rapid rehousing. FHPAP service activities eligible under coordinated entry include assessment, diversion, for example, assisting a household in identifying alternative housing arrangements, or referral to community resources, including FHPAP providers. Assistance provided can include basic needs and transportation, such as bus tokens or bus cards. Please note that assistance provided must be tied to a housing outcome. For example, transportation assistance that is provided to enable a household to move in with a relative. Please note that households referred to an FHPAP provider for rapid rehousing assistance must be entered into HMIS. FHPAP street outreach is defined as providing emergency services and engagement intended to link households who are homeless or at imminent risk of homelessness with available shelter, housing, and/or supportive services. Services can include safety provisions, conducting assessment, referrals to other programs and services, or on-site medical screening or assessment. Providers can also identify subpopulations that they will serve. For example, veterans, domestic and/or sexual violence victims, trafficked victims, or youth. Direct assistance provided can include basic needs or transportation assistance. As with coordinated entry, assistance provided must be tied to a housing outcome. Please note that households must be entered into HMIS when street outreach extends beyond the simple provision of resources and is a strategic effort to engage the participant in activities designed to end their homeless situation. Examples of this include assisting an individual in completing and submitting housing applications or transporting an individual to housing appointments. FHPAP prevention is the provision of financial assistance and/or supportive services to assist people in maintaining their existing housing, relocation to more appropriate permanent housing, and/or diverting them from entering the homeless system. Effective July 1st, 2019, grantees and subgrantees will be required to utilize the Minnesota Homeless Prevention Tool, formerly known as the Prevention Targeting Tool. Utilizing this assessment tool, providers will be expected to target their prevention resources to those households who will most likely become homeless within 30 days if they do not receive assistance. We know that this tool is new to many of you and that you may have questions. We're not going to dive into those questions today. Rather, we'll be addressing them during a later time, including a future coordinators meeting and also during the contract execution process. Services provided under prevention include administering the Minnesota Homeless Prevention Assessment Tool, referral to resources such as cash or non-cash assistance, legal aid assistance, employment and financial assistance, and providing budget assistance or tenant-landlord mediation. Financial assistance provided can include rental or mortgage assistance, utility assistance, including past due utilities, transportation assistance, and undesignated assistance. An example of undesignated assistance may include assisting a household in obtaining a Social Security card in order to apply for housing. Again, direct assistance must be tied to a housing stability outcome. Prevention assistance provided will primarily be one time, but we do want to stress that it is allowable to provide additional assistance in this category if further assessment determines that this is needed to maintain housing stability. HUD, as well as the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, identifies rapid rehousing as a critical strategy to addressing homelessness. Rapid rehousing's primary focus is to help households obtain permanent housing as quickly as possible, and assistance is designed to be flexible, adaptable, and based on the household needs. Rapid rehousing is generally provided short-term, that is between 1 and 6 months. However, there may be instances where a household needs longer-term assistance, and households are eligible for up to 24 months of assistance. Rapid rehousing has 3 core components designed to be tailored to the unique needs of the household. These components include housing identification. Interchangeably, we will use the term housing navigation, rent and move-in assistance, and case management and services. The minimum services expected under rapid rehousing include housing navigation assistance, which I will speak to more in a moment, and case management. Case management activities can include budgeting, life skill development, employment, training and support, tenant education, and connection to resources. Additional program services may include providing legal assistance, tenant-landlord mediation, education, and engagement. You may have also noticed from the application that homeless assistance, also known as one-time assistance, will no longer be a category in and of itself, and in addition will no longer be a project type within HMIS. This change takes effect on July 1st, 2019, the start of the new biennium. This does not mean that homeless assistance is not allowable. Rather, if one-time homeless assistance is provided, it will simply be under the rapid rehousing category. That said, it's important to note that rapid rehousing assistance is designed to be tailored to the household need. Households should be regularly assessed to determine the length and type of assistance needed to stabilize them in their housing. And if needed, assistance should be modified accordingly. For example, while it might initially be determined that a household needs one-time assistance only, if a later assessment determines they need additional assistance to obtain housing stability, this is acceptable. I want to stress just one more time, I know I've said this a few times, but the rapid rehousing is designed to be flexible, adaptable, and tailored to the household needs. I want to take a moment to talk about housing navigation, which is one of the 3 core components of rapid rehousing. Housing navigation extends beyond the simple provision of housing resources. This slide identifies several activities of housing navigation, and this is not meant to be an all-inclusive list. Housing navigation should be tailored to the needs of the household, who may or may not need all of these types of assistance identified. While participant involvement and direction should be sought in the housing search process, it is ultimately the rapid rehousing provider's responsibility to make every attempt to ensure that housing is identified and secured for each household. There are 3 categories of assistance that are allowable under FHPAP. These include supportive services, direct assistance, and administration. Supportive services include case management, housing navigation, assessment, and other services to assist the recipient in obtaining and maintaining housing. Eligible support service expenses include salary and benefits, mileage, supplies, copies, postage directly related to the program, training, and equipment such as phone and computer. Note that equipment costs must be prorated and cannot exceed the equivalent of the FTE assigned to the grant. For example, if a case manager works 50% under an FHPAP project and 50% under a HUD-funded project, the equipment charged to FHPAP cannot exceed 50% of the total. Supportive services cannot exceed more than 50% of the total budget without authorization from Minnesota Housing. Grantees can request to exceed this cap if they can provide clear rationale for doing so. For example, a grantee may request to increase support services and decrease direct assistance, such as rental assistance, if this type of assistance is available from another funding source. If a grantee wants to request exceeding the 50% supportive services cap, they must do the following. Consult with Minnesota Housing staff prior to submission of the formal request to exceed the cap. Consult with and receive approval from the grantee's local advisory committee. Submit a request in writing to Minnesota Housing, substantiating why the request is needed, and the percentage of the total grant the grantee is requesting for supportive services. Minnesota Housing staff will then inform grantees in writing whether this request is approved or denied. Eligible direct financial assistance includes rental deposits, rent payments, utilities including past due, and transportation and other costs that are tied to a housing stability outcome. Administration costs cannot exceed 10% of the total grant. Examples of administration costs include supplies, accounting, human resources, finance, insurance, technology support, personnel staff, both administrative staff and HMIS data staff, I just want to note, can go either in administration or it can go underneath the supportive service category, depending on who is responsible for doing the data entry. Also included in administration can be stipends to persons on the advisory committee who have lived experience and other types of expenditures directly related to administering the program. The following are ineligible expenses: acquiring, rehabilitating, or constructing emergency shelter, transitional or permanent housing, payment for more than 20 months of direct assistance and supportive services, payment for operating costs of emergency housing, including hotel, motel expenses or vouchers, and payment for operating and supportive service costs of permanent supportive housing.
Okay. So as you may have noticed during Nancy's presentation, there's a greater emphasis on a rapid rehousing philosophy that will be used with the homeless households that are currently accessing our program. And the idea behind this is really that we want to see the philosophical shift toward all homeless households having access to those core components. In the past, when we've done one-time assistance, it may have been possible that homeless households would access a provider, but not necessarily receive the potential assistance of housing navigation or case management. This way, all those components are available for each household. They just may not need them. So it's up to you to figure out and with the client what those needs might be, but it just allows them to have the breadth of service if they do need that in order to find housing. Nancy also highlighted the changes to how we've traditionally administered prevention by providing information on the Minnesota Homelessness Prevention Assessment Tool, and also about how households that are not able to access service through coordinated entry will be included in the prevention category. These represent changes from the FHPAP program of the past. Additionally, I want to highlight some of the focus areas of this biennium's application. First, you're going to see a focus on equity. We are trying to further our work toward ensuring that households who are disparately impacted by homelessness will have access to our programs and will benefit from these programs in an equitable way. Second, you will see woven throughout the application a focus on two generational approaches. We want to know how your program is including both child and parent needs in the process of serving households. We also want to know how you're including people with lived experience in your project in a meaningful way. Another thing that you'll see as a change in the application is the FHPAP relationship with your local housing trust fund administrators. As noted earlier, we will be aligning our application timeline with the Housing Trust Fund timeline. We expect FHPAP grantees to build relationships with their Housing Trust Fund administrators and begin thinking about how they might further align their FHPAP and Housing Trust Fund resources. And finally, we'll also talk about the preliminary practice model, which is a set of components that we believe make an impact on addressing homelessness. There are 6 sections of the application, including planning, project design, equity, collaboration, new applicant, and preliminary practice model. I will briefly walk through each one of the sections to give you an outline of what information we're looking for in the application. So for the planning section, we want to know more about the advisory committee. Specifically, we're interested in how the advisory committee supports persons' lived experience to attend the committee meeting, and whether certain parties such as schools or counties are participating, and we want to know how often. Because the statute requires a formerly homeless person be part of the advisory committee, we're very interested in how you are including or recruiting someone who has experienced homelessness in the past 3 years. Communities should also conduct a needs assessment to determine what will be the most helpful strategies for their community's homeless needs. The types of data that can be used vary, but we encourage both qualitative and quantitative data. An example of the qualitative data might be a focus group with participants or a survey of participants or providers. And then I also wanted to remind you of the MinFact tool that's available. One of the things that state staff created a couple of years ago, trying to figure out how we could do a better job of coordinating grant making, was to develop the Minnesota Needs Funding Activity Coordination Tool, also known as MinFAC. And what this tool can do is you can actually search by a specific region, such as a COC region, and then you can look at a different types of measures. So for example, income, poverty, and employment, and then it will load up and give you that information by the COC. And so you'll be able to see, here's what the gap in rent assistance, the mean gross rent, lower income homeowners spending more than 30%, and so on. It gives you quite a few data variables on each of these categories, and then you can search by COC, by county, and I believe by state, yes. So you can do comparisons. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was available, that that tool was here and can sometimes help you when you're conducting your needs assessment. Okay. So the final thing in the planning section that we would like you to talk about is your solicitation process. Some applicants are using a letter of intent. Some are actually conducting a local request for proposal process in a more formal way. But we want to hear about that, and we want to know about if you've included an appeal process or how that works. Is your advisory committee involved, and so on. We do also want to know that if an applicant has not used a solicitation process, provide us with the rationale about why you chose not to, what the reasons were behind not soliciting. And part of this just is also, again, centered on that idea that we really want to make sure we're meeting the needs of all households, especially those vulnerable households in the state of Minnesota, and those that are disparately impacted by homelessness. For the project design section, we want you to identify which of the populations you serve, whether it be families, singles, or youth, and or youth families. If you are not serving one of these populations, we want to know what you're doing with other funding and resources to address the population. We also want to know about any subpopulations, such as veterans or persons with disabilities. And finally, we want you to talk about any of the populations that have been disparately impacted by homelessness. For example, some of you may have seen the data that was recently released by ICA, who is our Homeless Management Information System Administrator. That information is available on the Minnesota HMIS website. But in Minnesota, it showed that African Americans and Native Americans were examples of populations that were disparately impacted by homelessness. And it could have, across the state, been 10 to 30 times more likely to become homeless. So paying attention to that information and data is really critical in trying to identify which populations you'll be serving. We are very interested to hear about how your project is unique and innovative. For current grantees, this will include innovation that you've been implementing over this past biennium and want to continue. We want you to get credit for any of the work that you've been doing, but also looking into this RFP and the next biennium, how will you continue that work or strengthen that work? And then for folks who want to have an opportunity to try something that they haven't tried before, this is your opportunity to talk about what you're planning to do. We really want to know if you have providers or subgrantees that you're going to be utilizing, as well as your own agency, if you have additional eligibility criteria. FHPAP really leans toward the least restrictive criteria, so we actually have included a table there for you to fill out, letting us know if your providers do have additional criteria. And I don't want to say that additional criteria is always a negative. For example, some folks, because there aren't enough resources available, they might restrict the income limit to be 150% of federal poverty guidelines instead of 200, for example. But we just want to know about what the additional criteria might be. And then finally, we want to hear about any programs where FHPAP is used for a portion of the program, such as when you're using emergency shelter grant funds. So the equity section is looking at how you're representing the people that you're serving, both with your own staff and agency and advisory committee, but also with your program itself. So we want to hear about your plans to increase the equity related to your staffing and your advisory committee composition, as well as what you're going to do in your project over the next biennium. While providing context of past actions is helpful, we're really more interested in the detailed plan for the upcoming biennium. Including people with lived experience in this process is helpful, including as much detail as possible, such as a timeline, the tasks, the people that are responsible. That's going to be what maximizes your points in this area. And this particular section is worth 10 points this year, so that is an increase from what we've seen in the past. The collaboration section is short, but this is where you're going to see the coordination with the Housing Trust Fund and with the local continuum of care. All about alignment. We recognize that when our programs are aligned with the state plan to prevent and end homelessness, and then also aligned with COC priorities, we can really make an impact in reducing homelessness. A great example of this is the focus on ending veteran homelessness. When the COCs really got on board with that process, and the FHPAP grantees were also referring to the Veterans Registry, we made a substantial impact in reducing veteran homelessness. And at this time, we have almost 50% of the state declaring a victory in that realm. There's a section for new applicants. New applicants who are applying for FHPAP funds and were not a recipient this past biennium will need to describe their progress toward implementing their FHPAP project. Examples would be how they established an advisory committee, how they conducted their needs assessment and got folks on board to partner with them. New applicants will also provide us with a description to clearly demonstrate that they have the capacity to administer the program. In addition to the project itself, the administrator must have the capacity to utilize HMIS and then to manage the local advisory committee activities. As former grantees can attest, administration of FHPAP is really unique to other programs because of the work of the advisory committee. The advisory committee requires a commitment on the part of the grant administrator to build the committee and form relationships with partners who will participate on the committee, such as counties, other service providers, landlords, schools, and more. New applicants must also provide a certificate of consistency with the COC as part of their application. Okay, now here's a hint for the future. For any of the existing grantees, speaking of certificate of consistency, everyone put an asterisk here. At the time that we make awards, we are likely to ask for a certificate of consistency from the local COC for all the applicants as part of our contracting process. This is going to be a new requirement. So if you are awarded funds, you will likely have to have a certificate of consistency from your local COC. We're in the process of developing a form for that, and this will definitely be outlined as part of the award process. The final part of the application is about the preliminary practice model. This model was designed by state staff and members of the Heading Home Funders Collaborative, but it was really driven by feedback from stakeholders about what program components they felt made a difference when assisting homeless and at-risk households. The model includes both components that were being utilized by providers, as well as components that seem to be missing from the toolbox of some of the providers. For this year, we're asking you to give us a straightforward assessment of which components your organization has implemented already or have been partially implemented or not implemented. There's no points given for that particular table. However, there will be up to 5 points for the second part of that section, where it asks you to name one component that you will work on for the next biennium. It can be a component that you've already started to work on during this existing biennium, but we're really, and are not finished with that yet, but we're looking for at least one, and giving a timeline, again, the person responsible or people responsible, and more detail will result in higher points for this question. Please ensure that you have signed the application. The application is in a Word format. That makes it really difficult to actually sign because our instructions are to give us back the application in its existing format. So you're going to have rich text format, Word format that you're going to be submitting the application back to us on. What grantees and applicants typically do is they take the signature page and they sign it, and then they make a PDF copy of just the signature page and submit that. And that's my recommendation to you. The other documents, including that application, needs to be submitted in the original format. The application instructions provide information on the overall scoring of the application. The bulk of points will come from the planning and project design questions, so this is where you're going to want to spend the bulk of your time. However, we've also intentionally included those higher points for the equity section, as I mentioned before. The total for the application is 65 points, but there are also performance points. For new applicants, they receive these points through the new applicants section. This allows the new applicants to compete for these performance points, which compare to the 35 points available to former grantees. Former grantees can receive up to 35 points for performance, and that includes whether they've expended a certain percentage of funds, achieved serving the projected number of households, submitted reports on time, provided our staff with timely communication, and attended all the important meetings. It also includes points for monitoring visits, as well as a review by their Minnesota Interagency Council on Homelessness representative. I'm now going to turn it back to Nancy, who's going to talk about the budget form, and then I'll give you some important information on the submission requirements. For those of you that have worked with FHPAP in the past, you may be pleased to see that there are no longer 4 pages of budget forms for each provider. So everyone can thank Nancy for squishing these all into 1 page.
All right, I apologize for a pause in between Diane and I, and it's because we are in an unexpected room, so we're having to pass everything back and forth. On this section, I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the budget template. I will open up this document and I'll walk through the highlights, and we'll be happy to open it up again during the question and answer session. First, I will show you where the budget template is located on our web page. We were not able to attach this link for some reason, but if you go under the Minnesota Housing web page, you go under FHPAP, and you go down to the bottom of that page, you will see it under the application materials after the application funding instructions. Right. Oh, sorry. The first tab is the instruction tab, and I won't go through all of that. I'm going to point out a couple things. The first highlighted item, it indicates that on the master FHPAP budget, there's only one area that you need to enter information, and that is the grantee name. There are actually 2 other cells that you have the option to enter information into, and when I get to that tab in just a moment, I will highlight what those are. I also want to highlight that when you're entering financial information, you will need to enter it in whole dollars only. It will not allow you to enter cents. So if you have a dollar amount that is with cents, you can round up or down accordingly. The next 2 tabs are the grantee information and the sub-grantee information tabs. It's pretty self-explanatory. We need 2 grantee contacts, an HMIS contact, executive director, board chair, and fiscal director for the grantee only. And the other exception is for the FHPAP grantee only, we need the federal ID number and the state tax ID number. All of your sub-grantees can be entered on this third tab, termed sub-grantee information. Now I'll move to the master FHPAP budget. I spoke earlier about where the instructions say you can only enter into the FHPAP grantee line. There are actually 2 additional spots. And they are, the first one is underneath the administration cost line items. It's an other category, and if you have expenses that are not identified above, you do have the ability to enter that in this other tab. And the same holds true for supportive services. You will see, if you haven't gone in this yet, that all of the rest of the cells are locked. There are 14 subsequent budgets that follow this master budget, or 15, excuse me, and everything entered into those tabs will auto-feed into the master FHPAP budget. You'll see at the bottom that we have the household information, and this also will be auto-fed from the subsequent budgets. The next budget is the grantee FHPAP budget. I just want to stress this is for the grantee only. There will be some grantees that may only have administration expenses because they only have administrative, not only, but they have administrative sight of the programs. And then there are some grantees that do provide supportive services and direct assistance. So all of this can be entered on the grantee FHPAP budget. I want to point out a couple things. With the administration FTE, we are only interested in the FTE, and we are not asking that that FTE be broken down in these categories of coordinated entry, outreach, prevention, rapid rehousing. You will note under supportive services, however, that we do want to see the FT breakdown in each of these categories. This also contains several locked cells, and this will calculate. I'm just going to give you an example. Oops. So the auto calculates on this tab, and then you will see that it will feed over to the master FHPAP budget. And the sub-grantee budgets are exactly the same as the grantee FHPAP budget. There are 14 sub-grantee budgets, and that's based on the current number that we have. If you do anticipate or know that you will have more than 14 sub-grantees, please reach out to me. My contact information is at the end of this presentation, and I will work with you to get you a spreadsheet that contains additional budgets. I want to stress one last thing. As it relates to entering household outputs, this is more applicable to coordinated entry and the outreach categories. There is a possibility that under coordinated entry, for example, you may plan on assessing, as an example, 200 households and anticipate referring 50 of those households to an FHPAP provider. So when you're entering outputs, please only enter the projected outputs for who you are planning on referring to an FHPAP provider. There will be an opportunity for you to report additional outputs in an additional format that will be separate from this budget category. And if you are one of those grantees, we will have that conversation with you during the contract execution phase.
Okay. I'm just going to switch us back to our PowerPoint. So I'm going to talk to you now about submitting the application itself. There's some really important changes that have taken place, and again, this is related to our work with trying to be in compliance with the Office of Grants Management, and also to have consistency in our agency with how our grant materials are submitted and reviewed. So there's a new step in our process internally when we go through the grant application review process. In the past, when applicants would submit their materials, we would collect them, distribute them out to reviewers. We would have a review meeting, and then we would determine who is going to receive funding based on their score and their performance and so on. In this biennium, we actually receive the submissions and then go through a step that is called meeting the threshold criteria. And so what that means is that your application has to meet a test once the application materials are submitted. Otherwise, it can be rejected completely before we even get to the point of reviewing it. So some of the things that, on the day that we receive the applications, we will ensure that the application meets the threshold criteria. And here are the things that you need to do to make sure that your application is meeting that criteria. You need to submit the application on time, which is February 13th before 4:30 p.m. The application needs to be complete, which means that you've answered every question that's in the application. The application is signed, goes back to that slide that I presented where you're going to sign the application page and submit it, most likely as a PDF. The budget has to be included and it has to be complete. So we need to be able to see that those cells are filled out and that you've submitted information for all of the sections. There's also an affirmative action requirement with corresponding paperwork and financial statements that will need to be submitted by specific agencies. I have a couple of slides on that, so I'll present those next. But lastly, if you're a new applicant, get on the agenda for your continuum of care meeting because you need to submit that certificate of consistency along with your application materials. If for some reason your continuum of care is not meeting before February 13th, please contact Nancy or myself and we'll work with you on that one. So for the affirmative action certification, if your response to the solicitation is in excess of $100,000, which most likely every applicant will be in excess of $100,000, you will want to complete the affirmative action form to determine if you're subject to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. In addition to that form, it also means that sometimes you have to provide us with the documentation of compliance. So depending on what box you check on that form, that's going to determine whether or not you're submitting additional material. And so just as an example, here's the affirmative action form that you would be filling out, and your agency likely has a copy of this somewhere. But it also, based on what you check, and that's why we can't tell you ahead of time if you're going to need an additional document or not, but if you're supposed to be in compliance, then you have a document that's registered usually with the state, and so you'll have a copy of that as well that you'll need to submit to us. For financial documentation, this applies to non-governmental organizations that are applying for $25,000 or more. So again, this is likely to apply to you, and it just depends on your agency's overall budget, the type of financial information that you're going to submit to us. So what's important to remember about this is that it's not about the amount you're requesting, it's actually about the total agency budget. So total gross revenue in a year that your agency has will determine which financial statements you're submitting to us. And if you have any questions on these, feel free to contact Nancy or myself, and we'll try to walk you through or try to connect you with the right pieces and how to get them. So here's our offer of the day. If you want to ensure that you're going to meet the threshold criteria, submit everything to us through the portal by February 7th. I realize this cuts your timeline on the grant. Everyone's probably laughing now, like, oh, sure. But it gives us the opportunity to look at your documents and make sure they will meet the threshold. We're willing to do that review. If we receive the documents by the 7th, we'll be able to get back to you. Hopefully, I think it's by the following couple of days, I think we have. And then that way you'll be able to submit any items that are missing or if they need to be resubmitted. We have had the most, I'll just give you an example. In a grant process that I have been a part of, we have had people accidentally submit the same document twice instead of submitting the document that, so maybe they were supposed to submit the application and the budget, and they submitted the application, and then they submitted another copy of the application, but somehow named it the budget, and then all of a sudden they don't have a budget. That application would be rejected. So it's really important to just think about being able to submit these materials, double checking yourself. If you're not going to use the offer that we have to submit by the 7th, just really making sure that whatever you're submitting to the portal is in good working order, is actually the document that you intended to submit. You will receive an email back that should tell you that the item was successfully submitted, so you'll at least know that you've submitted that particular item, especially if you do them one by one. Applicants are supposed to submit all their items by the application deadline, regardless of whether or not you choose to take Nancy and I up on this offer. So all application materials, again, are due Wednesday, February 13th at 4:30 p.m. Submit them in the original format to Minnesota Housing Secure Upload Tool. That information is available in your instructions and also in the information on our website. And this is going to look really redundant because I just went over threshold criteria with some of these same items. But for the submission, you're going to want to make sure that you've submitted an application. It'll be in Word or rich text format, and it's the original format that you have used for the application. An application signature page, this is where we allow you to submit a PDF. The budget for the applicant and all subgrantees, an affirmative action form and the corresponding certificate if that's required, your financial statement for your agency, and a certificate of consistency if you're a new applicant. The timeline is also in the instructions, but just letting you know that after that deadline, between February 13th and April 25th, Nancy and I will be working hard with some reviewers. They will likely be state staff, including staff from other state departments. We're also going to have community reviewers as part of our process. That's a new thing that we've been doing with our grant submission. And we'll have a review meeting probably in March, and then make final decisions and take that information to board as a recommendation on Thursday, April 25th. We should be able to notify you by the following Monday of your award, and so you will at that time receive an award letter, or you'll receive a letter stating that you were not awarded funding. And then Friday, May 10th, we've set up a due diligence training. That's part of the contract process. So we'll let you know what are the items that you need to submit to us in order to execute the agreement. And the due diligence approval and contract will start July 1st. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is that in prior bienniums, we were given some leeway on the execution date of agreements. So what this meant is that when we gave you that award decision, even if you were unable to pull together all of your contract documents by July 1st, we had leeway to sign after July 1st and then have the contract be retroactive to July 1st. We no longer have this flexibility. So, for example, if you need county board resolution and your county board doesn't meet between the time we notify you May 10th and July 1st, your contract will not start officially until after July 1st. And it won't be retroactive, so the payment would be adjusted accordingly. So all of the due diligence items need to be submitted to us before, well before July 1st, so that we can actually sign your agreement on time and you can execute as of July 1st. I appreciate your participation in our webinar today. It was our opportunity to kind of try out the GoToWebinar technology and instead of using ITV. So we'd love any feedback you have on that and how it worked for you. And if you felt like that's been as compared to the ITV that we used to do in the past. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon, great weekend. Thank you.